Judge Samuel Harwick had sentenced 23 men to hang. Now his own daughter's name was on the wanted poster, and he had to choose between the law he served and the blood he loved. The rope swayed empty in the wind, casting shadows that danced like ghosts across the courthouse steps. Judge Samuel Harwick stood at his office window, watching the hemp fiber twist and turn in the desert breeze, and wondered if justice had a smell. Dust and creosote, sweat and fear, the metallic tang of blood that seemed to hang in the air long after the crowds dispersed. 23 men he had sentenced to hang in 15 years on the bench. 23 souls he had delivered to their maker with the strike of his gavel and the weight of his certainty. The law was absolute, he had always believed, clean and sharp as a blade, unwavering as the North Star. But now, as he held the telegram that had arrived that morning, his hands trembling like autumn leaves, Samuel Harwick wondered if certainty was just another word for blindness. The telegram bore news that would have broken a lesser man's heart, but Samuel had spent years hardening his heart like leather left too long in the sun. His daughter Rebecca, his wild-eyed, fierce-hearted Rebecca, had been identified as the leader of the Crimson Canyon Gang, responsible for 3 bank robberies and the killing of 2 lawmen in neighboring counties. The words blurred before his eyes as he read them again, each letter a small knife twist in his chest. Rebecca Harwick, wanted for armed robbery and murder. Reward, $500, dead or alive. The paper crinkled in his grip, and he set it down carefully on his desk next to the framed photograph of a young girl with braided hair and a gap-toothed smile, holding a wooden doll he had carved for her 10th birthday. She had been 16 when she left, 4 years ago on a rain-soaked night when thunder crashed like the sound of his own heart breaking. They had argued, about what, he could barely remember now. Something about the hanging that day, a young man not much older than she was, whose crime had been stealing horses to feed his starving family. Rebecca had stood in this very office, her eyes blazing with an indignation that reminded him painfully of her mother, and accused him of being a man who valued law over mercy, order over compassion. "You've forgotten what it means to be human, Papa," she had said, her voice cracking with tears and fury. "All you see is guilt and innocence, black and white. But the world isn't made that way. People aren't made that way." He had responded with the cold authority that had served him well on the bench but had failed him as a father, telling her that the law was not a thing to be bent by sentiment or swayed by emotion. She had looked at him then with something that might have been pity, or perhaps it was disappointment, and walked out into the storm without another word. 4 years of silence. 4 years of wondering if she was safe, if she was warm, if she thought of him at all during the long desert nights. 4 years of telling himself that she would return when she was ready, that time would heal the wound between them. Now he knew where those years had led her, and the knowledge sat in his stomach like a stone. She had become the very thing he had spent his life fighting against. An outlaw, a killer, a threat to the order he had devoted himself to maintaining. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood, and Samuel wondered if God was laughing at him from whatever distant heaven judges went to when their work was done. The sun was setting when Marshal Davies knocked on his office door, his weathered face grave beneath the brim of his hat. Davies was a good man, honest and steady, the kind of lawman Samuel respected. He had served warrants and brought in fugitives with quiet efficiency for nearly a decade, never once questioning the sentences Samuel handed down. Now he stood in the doorway, with the weight of duty heavy on his shoulders and something that looked like sympathy in his eyes. "Judge," Davies said quietly, removing his hat, "I reckon you've seen the telegram." Samuel nodded, not trusting his voice to remain steady. The photograph of Rebecca seemed to watch him from its place on his desk, her young face frozen in a moment of innocence that felt like a lifetime ago. "I've got my orders," Davies continued. "Governor wants the Crimson Canyon Gang brought in, and he wants them brought in soon. There's talk of sending federal marshals if we can't handle it ourselves. And you're asking for my blessing to hunt down my own daughter?" Samuel's voice came out flat and hard, the tone he used when pronouncing sentence. But beneath the hardness was something raw and bleeding, something that no amount of judicial authority could bandage. Davies shifted uncomfortably, his hat turning in his hands like a prayer wheel. "I'm asking if you want to step aside, Judge. Let someone else handle this." no shame in it. Samuel stared out the window at the empty gallows, thinking of all the men who had stood there in their final moments, some defiant, some weeping, some silent as stones. He had watched them all with the same dispassionate certainty, believing that justice was larger than any individual pain, more important than any personal cost. Now he understood what those men had felt in their last moments, the terrible weight of consequence, the crushing inevitability of a world that offered no mercy to those who stepped outside its lines. "No," he said finally. "I won't step aside. The law applies to everyone, Marshal, even to her, especially to her." Davies nodded slowly, though something in his expression suggested he had hoped for a different answer. "We'll head out at first light. Word is they're holed up in the old mining camp at Devil's Backbone, about 2 days' ride north. You sure about this, Judge?" Samuel picked up the telegram and read it once more, the words burning themselves deeper into his memory with each reading. Rebecca Harwick, wanted dead or alive. His little girl who used to catch fireflies in mason jars and fall asleep in his lap while he read her stories about brave princesses and noble knights. The little girl who had grown into a young woman with fire in her heart and justice in her soul, who had looked at him with disappointment and walked out into a storm because she believed he had forgotten how to be human. "I'm sure, Marshal. We ride at dawn." The desert stretched before them like a sea of golden red, undulating beneath the weight of the morning sun. Samuel rode beside Davies and 3 other men, their horses' hooves raising small clouds of dust that caught the light and dispersed like prayers on the wind. The landscape was both beautiful and merciless, carved by wind and time into shapes that spoke of endurance and loss, of things that had learned to survive in a place that offered no comfort and little hope. It was country that bred hard people, Samuel reflected. People who understood that survival sometimes required choices that gentler souls could never make. They made camp the first night beside a creek that ran shallow and quick over smooth stones, the water singing a quiet song that reminded Samuel of Rebecca's voice when she was small and used to hum while she worked in their small garden behind the house. She had been good with growing things, patient and gentle with seeds and seedlings, coaxing life from the reluctant earth with a tenderness that had always surprised him. Now she was wanted for taking life instead of nurturing it, and the contradiction felt like a weight pressing down on his chest every time he drew breath. Davies sat beside him at the fire, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold hours ago. The other men had rolled out their bedrolls and were lost in whatever dreams visiting men brought to the desert. But Samuel found sleep elusive. The stars wheeled overhead in their ancient patterns. The same stars that had watched over Rebecca during her years in the wilderness. The same stars that would bear witness to whatever came next. "Tell me about the killings," Samuel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the crackling of the fire. Davies glanced at him, his weathered face thoughtful. "Both were clean shots, if that's what you're asking. No torture, no unnecessary violence. Word from witnesses is that she tried to avoid bloodshed where she could, but when cornered," he shrugged. "A lawman's still a lawman, Judge, and an outlaw's still an outlaw." Samuel nodded, though the information brought no comfort. He had hoped, perhaps, that the reports were exaggerated, that Rebecca had somehow remained the idealistic young woman who had left his house 4 years ago. But the world had a way of changing people, of taking their dreams and twisting them into something sharp and dangerous. The desert was full of such transformations, rivers that had become arroyos, mountains that had crumbled into canyons, hopes that had hardened into necessities. "What do you think made her choose this path?" Samuel asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Davies was quiet for a long moment, staring into the flames as if they might offer some wisdom. "Hard to say, Judge. Sometimes people just reach a point where they can't see any other way. Sometimes the world pushes them until they push back." He paused, then added carefully, "Sometimes they're looking for something they can't find in the places they've been." Samuel understood. Rebecca had been looking for a kind of justice that couldn't be found in his courtroom, a mercy that had no place in his understanding of the law. She had gone seeking what he had been unable to give her, a world where compassion and justice could exist side by side, where right and wrong weren't separated by the sharp blade of legal precedent, but woven together like threads in a tapestry too complex for any one person to fully understand. The second day brought them to the foothills of Devil's Backbone, a jagged ridge of rock that rose from the desert floor like the spine of some buried giant. The old mining camp sat in a narrow canyon, its abandoned buildings weathered to the color of bone and shadow. Smoke rose from one of the structures, a thin gray line that might have been a signal or simply the necessity of cooking food and keeping warm. Samuel's heart hammered against his ribs as they approached, each hoof beat bringing him closer to a confrontation he had spent 4 years both dreading and hoping for. Davies raised his hand, calling for a halt. "Judge," he said quietly, "last chance to let someone else handle this." Samuel looked at the smoke rising from the canyon, imagining Rebecca inside one of those crumbling buildings, perhaps cleaning her weapons or planning her next move or simply sitting by a fire and thinking about the choices that had brought her to this place. She would be 20 now, no longer the angry 16-year-old who had stormed out of his office, but a woman shaped by years of hardship and violence and whatever dreams had sustained her through the long exile from everything she had once known. "No," he said, dismounting from his horse. "This is something I have to do myself." He walked into the canyon alone, leaving the marshal and his men positioned on the ridge above with orders to wait for his signal. The buildings loomed around him like the bones of some ancient civilization, their empty windows watching his approach with the patient attention of things that had seen too much and understood too little. His boots crunched on gravel and broken glass, each step echoing off the canyon walls like a judgment being pronounced. She was waiting for him in what had once been the camp's saloon, sitting at a table that had survived the years better than the rest of the furniture. Rebecca had grown tall and lean, her face weathered by sun and wind, but still recognizably the daughter he had loved and lost. Her hair was shorter now, pulled back in a practical braid, and her clothes were the rough canvas and leather of someone who lived by necessity rather than fashion. But her eyes were still the same fierce green that had challenged him on that rainy night 4 years ago, still burning with the passion that had driven her into the storm and the wilderness beyond. "Hello, Papa," she said quietly, her hand resting near the grip of the pistol holstered at her side. "Rebecca." Her name felt strange in his mouth, like a word from a language he had once known but had forgotten how to speak. "You've grown. So have you. Older, I mean." She studied his face with the careful attention of someone who had learned to read danger in the smallest details. "I heard about the telegram. $500, dead or alive. That's quite a price on my head." Samuel took a step closer, his hands empty and visible. The distance between them felt vast, a chasm carved by years of silence and choices that couldn't be taken back. "I had to come," he said. "I had to see you." "To arrest me?" Her voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the old hurt underneath, the wound that had never quite healed. "To drag me back so you can hang me like all the others?" "To understand," Samuel said. "To understand how we got here. How I failed you so completely that this seemed like the only path left." Rebecca's laugh was sharp and bitter, like wind cutting through stone. "You didn't fail me, Papa. You succeeded perfectly. You taught me exactly what the law looks like when it forgets about mercy, what justice becomes when it's more concerned with being right than being human." She stood slowly, her hand still near her weapon, but not quite threatening. "Those men I killed. They were good men, probably. Men with families and hopes and all the small dreams that make life worth living. But they were also men who would have killed me without hesitation, because that's what the law demanded of them. They were following orders, just like you taught them to." Samuel felt the weight of her words like stones in his chest. "The law has to mean something, Rebecca. Without it, we have only chaos. And with it, we have only cruelty dressed up as virtue." She moved to the broken window, looking out at the desert that stretched beyond the canyon. "Do you know why I started robbing banks, Papa? Not for the money, though we needed that to survive. I did it because those banks were foreclosing on farms and ranches, taking the only homes some of these families had ever known. The law said it was legal, that contracts were sacred and debts had to be paid, but the law didn't care that these people were starving, that they had children who would grow up without roofs over their heads or food in their bellies. So you decided to become judge and jury yourself?" Samuel's voice carried the old authority, the tone he used when delivering sentences from his bench. "I decided to become what you taught me to be," Rebecca replied, turning back to face him. "Someone who looks at a situation and makes a choice about what's right and what's wrong. The only difference is that I chose mercy over law, while you chose law over mercy." The silence stretched between them, filled with the weight of 4 years' worth of unspoken words and the echo of choices that had led them both to this moment in this abandoned place. Samuel looked at his daughter, this woman who had grown from his teachings into something he barely recognized, and felt the foundations of his certainty cracking like stone under pressure. "What happens now?" he asked quietly. Rebecca's hand moved to her pistol grip, but her expression remained calm, almost peaceful. "Now you have to choose, Papa. The same choice you've been making for 15 years. The same choice that drove me away in the first place. Is the law more important than love? Is justice more important than family? Is being right more important than being human?" Samuel closed his eyes and saw the faces of 23 men he had sentenced to hang, each one looking at him with some mixture of fear and defiance and resigned acceptance. He had never doubted those decisions, never questioned whether the law he served was worth the lives it claimed. But now, standing in this ruined place and facing the daughter who had become a mirror of his own choices, Samuel Harwick felt doubt creeping into his heart, like water seeping through stone. When he opened his eyes, Rebecca was watching him with an expression that reminded him of her mother, patient and kind, but also infinitely sad, as if she already knew what he would choose and was grieving for them both. The canyon walls caught the late afternoon light and held it like a blessing, painting the ruined buildings in shades of gold and amber that made everything look holy despite the years of abandonment and decay. Samuel stood in that light and felt the weight of his entire life pressing down on him. Every decision, every sentence, every moment when he had chosen the cold certainty of law over the messy complexity of human need. The judge in him knew what he should do. The father in him knew what he wanted to do. The man in him, the part he had buried beneath years of duty and righteousness, wasn't sure he remembered the difference anymore. "I've been carrying your photograph for 4 years, he said finally, his voice barely audible in the desert silence. "That picture of you with the doll I carved. I'd look at it sometimes late at night in my office and wonder if you were safe. Wonder if you ever thought about coming home." Rebecca's expression softened slightly, though her hand remained near her weapon. "I thought about it, especially the first winter, when the cold was so bad I could barely feel my fingers, and I was living on whatever I could catch or steal. I dream about our house, about the fire in the kitchen, and the way you used to read to me from those old books of poetry." She paused, her eyes distant with memory. "But then I'd remember that last night, the way you looked at me like I was something broken that needed fixing instead of someone who was trying to understand the world. I couldn't come back to that, Papa. I couldn't come back to being your disappointment." "You were never my disappointment," Samuel said, and the words came out raw and honest in a way that surprised him. "You were my pride, my joy, my hope for something better than what I'd managed to build with my life. When you left, it felt like losing your mother all over again, like losing the best part of myself." "Then why?" The question came out fierce and desperate, years of hurt and confusion contained in that single word. "Why couldn't you see that those people needed mercy more than they needed punishment? Why couldn't you understand that sometimes being right isn't enough?" Samuel looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had grown old enough to question his certainties. He saw the woman she had become, shaped by the choices he had forced her to make, hardened by the world she had been driven to enter. But he also saw the girl she had been, the one who had caught fireflies and asked him to explain why some stories had sad endings, and whether good people ever did bad things for good reasons. "Because I was afraid," he said quietly. "Because if I started questioning one decision, I'd have to question them all. 23 men, Rebecca. 23 lives that I ended because I believed the law was bigger than any one person's pain. If I admitted that mercy might sometimes matter more than justice, then I'd have to face the possibility that some of those men didn't deserve to die, that some of their families were left broken for no better reason than my need to feel righteous." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke, visible and choking. Rebecca stared at him for a long moment, and Samuel saw something shifting in her expression. Not forgiveness exactly, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "So what now?" she asked again, her voice gentler this time. "Do you arrest me? Take me back to face trial and almost certain execution? Or do you finally choose something other than the law?" Samuel thought of Marshal Davies waiting on the ridge with his men, patient and loyal, ready to follow whatever orders his judge might give. He thought of the telegram still folded in his pocket, the words that had branded his daughter as an outlaw and put a price on her head. He thought of his courtroom back in town, empty now but soon to be filled again with cases requiring his judgment, his certainty, his willingness to separate right from wrong with the clean stroke of a gavel. "There's a third choice," he said slowly, the words forming as he spoke them, shaped by understanding that felt both foreign and familiar. "I could resign from the bench, give up my position, my authority, my right to judge others for their choices. We could leave together. Go somewhere neither of us is known, where you're not wanted and I'm not expected to be something other than a man trying to make sense of an impossible world." Rebecca's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Samuel saw the girl she had been, surprised and hopeful and just a little bit afraid to believe in the possibility of something she had never dared to want. "You would do that?" she asked. "Give up everything you've worked for? Everything you believe in?" "I believe in you," Samuel said simply. "I believe in the woman you've become, even if I don't understand all the choices that brought you here. I believe that maybe it's time for me to learn something about mercy from the daughter who's been trying to teach it to me for years." The silence that followed was different from the others, not empty but full, pregnant with possibility, and the strange hope that sometimes comes when impossible things suddenly seem within reach. Rebecca took a step toward him, then stopped, her hand finally moving away from her weapon for the first time since he had entered the saloon. "They'll come after us," she said, "both of us. The law doesn't forgive judges who abandon their duty, and it certainly doesn't forgive outlaws who escape justice." "Then we'll deal with that when it comes," Samuel replied. "Together. The way we should have been dealing with everything all along." Rebecca nodded slowly, and Samuel saw tears gathering in the corners of her eyes. The first tears he had seen her shed since she was a child. "What about your men on the ridge? Davies and the others?" Samuel considered this for a moment, thinking of the marshal who had served him faithfully for so many years, who would be expecting orders and explanations, and some kind of resolution to the mission that had brought them here. "I'll tell them the truth, that the Crimson Canyon gang scattered when they saw us coming, that Rebecca Harwick got away in the confusion. It's not exactly a lie. The woman they're hunting for doesn't exist anymore. She's about to become someone else entirely. And if they don't believe you, then I'll remind them that I'm still a judge, at least for a few more hours, and my word carries weight in these matters." Samuel managed a small smile, the first genuine smile he had felt in years. "Besides, Davies is a good man. He understands that sometimes the most important laws are the ones written in hearts rather than books." Rebecca crossed the remaining distance between them then, and Samuel opened his arms to receive her. She felt different than she had as a child, stronger, more solid, shaped by years of hardship and survival. But she also felt like coming home, like finding something precious that he had thought was lost forever. They held each other in the ruins of that old saloon, while the desert wind whispered through the broken windows and the setting sun painted everything in shades of gold and possibility. "Where will we go?" Rebecca asked, her voice muffled against his shoulder. "Somewhere the desert ends," Samuel said. "Somewhere green and gentle, where people don't know our names or our stories. Somewhere we can start over, learn how to be father and daughter again instead of judge and outlaw." "And what will we do? How will we live?" Samuel thought about this for a moment, considering all the skills and knowledge he had accumulated in his years on the bench, all the understanding of human nature and conflict, and the delicate balance between order and compassion. "Maybe we'll help people," he said finally. "People with problems that can't be solved by law books or court proceedings. People who need someone to listen to their stories and help them find a path that leads somewhere other than a hangman's noose or a life on the run." Rebecca pulled back to look at him, her eyes bright with something that might have been hope or might have been the reflection of the setting sun. "A different kind of justice?" "The kind of justice you were trying to teach me about," Samuel said. "The kind that remembers that behind every law is a human heart, and behind every crime is a human story. the kind that understands that sometimes mercy matters more than being right. They walked out of the canyon together as the sun touched the horizon, painting the sky in shades of fire and promise. On the ridge above, Samuel could see Marshal Davies and his men waiting patiently for word, for orders, for some resolution to the hunt that had brought them to this place. He would have to face them soon, would have to find words to explain the decision that felt both impossible and inevitable, both like the end of everything he had been and the beginning of everything he might still become. But for now, in the space between sunset and darkness, Samuel Harwick walked beside his daughter through the desert that had shaped them both, listening to her voice as she told him stories of the years they had spent apart. Her voice was different now, deeper, stronger, marked by experiences he could only imagine. But it still carried the music he remembered from when she was small, and the world seemed full of nothing but possibility. Behind them, the wind stirred the dust of the abandoned mining camp, erasing their footprints and covering their trail as if the desert itself understood the necessity of new beginnings. And ahead of them, somewhere beyond the reaches of law and judgment and the weight of choices that could never be unmade, lay the promise of country neither of them had ever seen, green and gentle and forgiving, a place where fathers and daughters might learn to build justice with their hearts instead of their certainties, where mercy and love might finally find room to grow in soil that had been prepared by years of hard-earned wisdom and the bitter grace of second chances. The stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the same stars that had watched over 23 hangings and 4 years of separation and countless decisions made in courtrooms, in canyons, and the secret places of the heart where all true judgments are born. Tonight they would bear witness to something different, not an ending, but a beginning, not a sentence, but a pardon, not justice as it had always been, but justice as it might still become in the hands of those brave enough to believe that even judges and outlaws could find their way home to each other when love proved stronger than law and mercy proved deeper than the need to be right. If you enjoyed this incredible tale from the frontier, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories from the American West. Click on the video on the screen for another tale we think you will love.